Hello and most welcome to 1091 of the Heidegger series. Here we are at Aios Nikolaus, very old church, and it goes to show that knowledge is situated in what Heidegger called Geschichte, not in representations or references. It is living in the language is the world, and it's pretty massive. I would say this is an enlarging of my world in just a fashion that is beyond belief. All thanks to Heraclitus. Let's see here if we can get So we continue here with Heraclitus in the face or in the mask of Charles H. Cairns writing, and delving more and more into thinking itself. And what surprises me is that we don't regard thinking as anything. It is just the reflection or the mirror image, as Rodolphe Gasset would say, of something external, something unreal. By doing so, both thinking and the external world disappears. None of them survives. None of them are strictly here. This is page 273. 101 or D115. To the soul psyche belongs a report, logos, that increases itself. This statement would be of great interest for the theory of the psyche if we could be sure that it comes from Heraclitus. Unfortunately, the language is not distinctive enough to guarantee authenticity, and the textual attestation is weak. There is a suspicious resemblance to the definition of psyche, which Aristotle cites and refutes as the number which moves itself. However, since there is a reference to the logos of soul in 35, D45, and since the notion that the psyche grows or feeds itself with the body is attested in Hippocratic writings, it is just possible that 101 is after all a quotation from Heraclitus. Let's hope that. With all due caution, then, I conjecture One, that the self-augmenting power of the psyche is part of what is meant by the deep logos of the soul in 35, D45. And two, that this power of self-expansion is manifested in the exhalation or boiling up of heated vapor. Heraclitus would thus conceive the psyche as Homer conceived wrath, which increases like smoke within the breasts of men. This expanding logos of the soul would be something quite different from the logos or measure of the sea, which remains constant despite its transformations. (102) B36. For souls, psyche, it is the death to be born as water. For water, it is death to become earth. Out of earth, water arises, is born. Out of water, soul, psyche. Another example of ring composition in 102 ends where it began, with the word psyche. The shift from the plural psyche to the singular prevents the repetition from being too mechanical, but this shift is probably motivated by a difference in connotation. The plural form at the beginning suggests the soul or life breath of individual men, which, in popular belief, abandons the body at death and passes as a phantom to the world below. But the singular form points to psyche as a constituent of the natural order, like earth or water, compared to the generic singular in 35. Heraclitus thus replaces the Homeric picture of the descent of human psyche into the underworld with his own account of the elemental way down to water and earth, after which the same stages are repeated in reverse order as a way up. As we have seen, the language of birth and death seems to allude here to a mystical cycle of rebirth, as in the Pythagorean doctrine. Only the transition downward to water and earth is described as death as well as birth. The return upward is described only as birth or becoming. Given the careful symmetry of this and similar fragments, the strong asymmetry here is scarcely accidental, insofar as the ways up and down are one and the same. That is from 103. Every birth can also be described as death. But there is another sense in which the way down is more truly the path of mortality, the quenching of fire, whereas the way up is in the same sense the path of life and rekindling. We thus have a foothold within Heraclitean psychophysics for the dualism required by a distinguished destiny for noble deaths. There is an obvious parallel between the sequence of stages here and the passage from sea to earth and back again, described in 38 to 39. What is new, besides the substitution of water for sea, is the description of these transitions in terms of death and birth, and the presence of Psyche at the beginning and end of the series. These 2 points are connected. For Heraclitus, everything is a form of life, and there can be no fundamental discontinuity between the realm of the psyche and the realm of elemental transformation. (102) makes this clear by integrating the psyche within a series of physical transformations. What physical form does Heraclitus associate with the soul? 102 says only that the psyche passes into and reappears out of water. From this, it has been generally inferred on the strength of the parallel with 38 and 239, that the psyche must be identified with the principle of fires, whose reversal are described in these fragments, in those fragments. The inference is surely a curious one. Given the evidence before us, for fire vanishes into smoke and ashes, but not into water, and if fire can burst forth from many things, water is not one of them. What we expect to find emerging from and returning to watery form is some type of vapor, steam, cloud, or air, the product of water by evaporation and the source of rain or moisture by condensation. That this is what Heraclitus has in mind here is confirmed by the other texts that speak of Psyche as alternatively moist, 116 to 118, 108, 106 to 108, D77, and dry, for of course air, wind and vapor may in fact be either dry or humid, whereas this contrast makes no sense if applied to fire or flame. Hence Psyche changes to water by precipitation or condensing, just as water changes to earth by further condensation. The relevant parallel is to the series of elemental transformations ascribed to Anaximenes and attested for Anaxagoras. Psyche here occupies the place of air, wind and cloud in the standard sequence. By his substitution of soul for air, Heraclitus has reshaped the element physics of Milesian cosmology as a doctrine focused on the human principle of life and mortality. As proxy for the elemental power of atmosphere, Psyche in 102 corresponds somehow to the prester or lightning storm of 38, which emerges from sea in what appears to be an upward path of elemental change. This suggests not that Psyche and prester are physically identical, but that there must be some analogy between the human soul and the flash of lightning in the sky. The force of this analogy will be brought out in 119. As was noted, most modern commentators have interpreted the parallel between 102 and 38 to 39, as showing that Heraclitus identified the soul with elemental fire. This mistake follows directly from the assumption that in both cases Heraclitus is expounding a theory of three and only three elemental forms. But this assumption, for which there is no ancient authority, is without any basis in the texts, except precisely as a misreading of 38 and 102, taking them both as expressions of a complete theory of elemental transformation. The misreading, which goes back as far as Zeller, is itself the result of an erroneous conception of Heraclitus as a prosaic cosmologist or physicos. This is just so good. Zeller took over this misconception from Aristotle and Theophrastus, but neither one committed to the modern mistake of identifying psyche as fire in Heraclitus. Aristotle described the soul as a vaporous exhalation, anathemisias, which means something like smoke of steam or mist. The Theophrastic doxography in Diogenes is silent on this point, but in the remote echoes of this doxography in Aetius and Philo, the soul is defined respectively as anathemias and pneuma, breath and wind. So the Stoics attributed to Heraclitus the view that souls steam up or exhaled anatheomiontai from moisture, 113b. The respectable ancient evidence is thus unanimous in confirming the natural interpretation of 102, with the psyche understood as a kind of atmospheric vapor emerging from water. It is in fact a prevalent view in early thought in Greece as elsewhere that the soul or spirit of man is a kind of vital breath, inhaled from birth or from the moment of creation in the case of Adam, and expired at death. Thus an interlocutor of Socrates reports that most men will suppose that when the psyche leaves the body at death, it is scattered like wind, pneuma, or smoke. This is from Phaedo 78. It was just this commonplace view of the soul as an atmospheric substance, like breath, that was developed in quasi-scientific form in the school of Ionian natural philosophy from Anaximenes to Diogenes or Apollonia. And I would say that continues to this day. The cyclical movement of 102 parallels the movement between light and darkness, waking and sleeping in 90, as well as the cycle of generations in 95 and 97 to 98. It contains no hint of any higher cyclic path, such as will be suggested in 109 to 112. The way up and the way down is one and the same. 103 calls out for some context which it does not provide. I have placed it here as a comment on the cyclical destiny of the psyche, which is at the same time a passage through higher and lower elemental forms. Both psychological and elemental interpretations of 103 are well entrenched in ancient commentary, and there is no need to choose between them, since elements and psyche are so many different phases or aspects of a single reality, the kindling and the quenching of cosmic fire. There is still simpler, more literal interpretation, proposed by Calogero and developed by Kirk, page 112, which takes the statement to mean only that every uphill path can equally be described as downhill, depending upon where one is standing, just as it is one and the same road that runs from Philadelphia to New York and from New York to Philadelphia. This literal reading of 103 is presupposed by both the psychological and elemental interpretations. 104. One must quench violence, hybris, quicker than a blazing fire. (104) is the only fragment where fire is presented in negative terms, as a purely destructive force. This may simply reflect the fact that Heraclitus is exploiting the familiar literary conceit to quench hybris. But perhaps there is more at stake. In form, this fragment recalls two others. 538. Corpses are more to be thrown out than dung. And 30. One must hold fast to what is shared by all, as a city holds to its laws, and even more firmly. End of sight. This common comparative pattern suggests that beyond the traditional warning against hybris, 104 is designed to express a more distinctly Heraclitean thought, as an enemy attack on the city wall threatens all the inhabitants of the city, so a house on fire threatens the whole neighborhood with destruction. And just as the defense of the civic law is seen in 515 to be as vital as the defense of the wall, so here the suppression of hybris, the suppression of that violence which disregards the law and endangers the community, is seen to be more urgent than the quenching of a fire raging out of control. In alluding to the dangerous power of fire, Heraclitus thus implicitly qualifies his praise for the principle of war and conflict when it appears as wanton violence. Like strife, fire itself can become purely destructive if it threatens civic unity and the common interests of all. Toxinon panton. The formal parallel to the aphorism on corpses suggests that there may also be some hidden connection between the fire of hybris and the destiny of the soul. This hint will be pursued in the commentary on 105. 105 or D85. It is hard to fight against passion, themos, for whatever it wants it buys at the expense of the soul, psyche. As Reinhardt remarked, 105 seemed to presuppose a customary phrase about buying something with psyche, where the meaning is paying for it with one's life, as the purchase of freedom or glory. But this sense of the phrase leads to paradox, for to pay with one's life for something noble, as in the decision of Achilles to avenge Patroclus, is an action we expect Heraclitus to approve of. Why should one struggle against themos in the consequences of yielding to it are so noble? And how can this threat to one's life explain why resistance is so difficult? The beginning of an answer might be found in Heraclitus is alluding precisely to the anger, themos, of Achilles, which was paid for by the death of Patroclus. See the reference in parenthesis to Achilles' refusal to quench his wrath at Iliad 9:678, end of parenthesis. But this line of thought is ruled out by most commentators, who take themos not as anger, but as desire or appetite generally, what Plato and Aristotle call epithemia. On this view, the loss of psyche is a result of sensual indulgence, as in drink. The gratification of desire implies the exchange of dry soul fire for moisture, said Burnett, referring for support to 106. This modern view must be mistaken, however, for it flies in the face of the classical understanding of themos as manly spirit or anger, to be sharply distinguished from sensual appetite, epithemia, as in the tripartite psychology of Plato's Republic. When Aristotle and Plutarch cite 105, they always take themos in this sense, just as Plato does in the two passages where he apparently echoes our text. We could believe that the ancients misunderstood Heraclitus here only if we had some reason to suppose that the sense of themos in his Ionic dialect differed substantially from the Attic usage familiar to Plato and other writers. But the opposite is the case, as we see from Herodotus. Although he does not show some trace of the older, wider use of the word in Homer, where themos could mean heart or spirit in general, the organ of mind and intelligence, as well as desire, end of parenthesis, is in most instances Herodotus' use of themos corresponds closely to that of Plato. I conclude that our ancient sources understood Heraclitus perfectly when they took themos to mean anger. The picture of aggressive rage as difficult adversary to fight against is vivid and striking, and hence the success of Heraclitus' phrase. The imagery of combat would be much less opposite if we took themos as sensual desire. This leaves us with the question, how yielding to anger is to be connected with loss of psyche. And beyond a possible allusion to the death of Patroclus, the answer must depend upon the Heraclitean view of psyche as a kind of breath or vapor. Anger and psyche are thus related by the fact that both can be understood in terms of anathemiasis, the boiling up of some sort of steaming vapor. Anger is so difficult to resist precisely because of its expression, the passionate act of self-affirmation. In righteous rage or indignation, resembles so close to the principle of vitality as such, the fiery affirmation of one's own life. But just as fire and strife must be quenched when they threaten the common good, 104, so the spirit of anger can lead to crime and destruction if allowed to rage unchecked. As Democritus said, in what is a continuation rather than a negation of Heraclitus' thought, although it is hard to fight against anger, themos, it is the task of a man to prevail over it, if he has good sense. The tendency of anger to lead to acts of hybris or wanton violence explains how it works its will at the expense of the psyche, by damage to the agent's own vital interests and to the life of others in an outburst of destructive rage. But Heraclitus' thought should probably also be spelled out in psychophysical terms. We must prevent the fire of wrath and hybris from consuming our own life breath. Yielding to irrational anger may thus be seen as a kind of suicide by self-conflagration. Listen to that, Edith, the psychoanalyst who quenched or took away her own soul. This would imply that there is another death for the psyche, distinct from but comparable to the dissolution of water into water, an excess of unthinking ardor that wastes the psyche in vain, instead of risking it deliberately in a noble cause. I think this causes some sort of commentary. In modern time, ignoring Heraclitus' warning and insight, we turn the soul into material substance, and thereby we made it terminable, unavoidable. It is something physical for each and every Westerner, and this has been the case long before even Christianity. And then it entered in Christianity, and this is the reason why in the Milgram today you don't see anybody trusting the idea of the soul to be immortal. So you won't put your foot down and say, I trust this, I stand for this. This never happens anyway. And I would say the reason is that we made the soul a material thing, just like Plato. And thereby we can kill it off. And it makes sense. If the soul, as I think, is something spiritual, not a material thing as it is today, it must be influenced by how we act emotionally. If this part is anathanatos, it must be possible to change and affect depending how we act and how we are. So we can kill off the soul, but we can also make it stronger. And then, because we get so much more complexity from Heraclitus, that incredible, stupendous oversimplification of modern times where the soul is just a lump of black substance, which is really horrifying. It's ignorance beyond belief. The soul is complication, and it takes lifetimes to understand how it works. It is investigation, learning, and knowing. So 3 things we abandon. The body is something we took up early in the series. Now we understand that the soul disappears when we abandon language and say that all words are substitutable or just random signs. That is taking away of the soul, something that Saussure blasphemously engaged into. Horrific act of violence to thinking itself. And the third is, of course, how we today don't have an inner side at all. Thinking is just unknowable. Thinking could at the most be substance. And I say it is something much, much more than substance. Existence is such a low way of ontology. It becomes very low scale, it becomes crude, it becomes polar oppositions. It becomes not delicate, not sharp. It is like walking with big boots on the opera scene, clenching everything down and saying that the opera is just words and singing is a parasitic tendency on speaking, something that Steven Pinker argues for on the internet. Steven Pinker is also one of those modern Saussurean persons that really reifies his admiration for false conclusions and oversimplifications. He actually has a video on the internet where he defends rationality. If you need a good laughter, I recommend you to put your eyes to that. It may be raised as an objection to this view that it spoils the neat one-to-one correlation between different stages on the elemental way, up and down, and some linear scale of nobler and baser destinies for the soul. It now turns out that not every passage of the psyche into a more fiery condition will be a greater share. A fate which a wise hearer might choose. On this reading of 105, fire can be a force of irrational destruction in the soul as well as in the city. But what the psychophysical theory loses in simplicity, it gains in subtlety and realism. For a man of spirit, anger is indeed a greater temptation than drink or sensuality, just because its ardor resembles that of courage and nobility of soul. Thus, the wrathful man will see his own motivations in terms of honor or justice, even when pursuing a course of blind destruction. I note, by the way of anticipation, that there need be no contradiction between this conception of anger as irrational ardor of the psyche and 109, for the latter distinguishes the wisest and best soul by its dryness and clarity, not by its heat. (106) A man when drunk is led by a beardless boy, stumbling, not perceiving where he's going, having his psyche moist. 106 may almost do without a commentary. The reader scarcely needs reminding that the joke about the man who has drenched his soul with drink is also to be taken literally, as a reference to psychic dissolution or partial death into the watery element. I note only the resonance here with the language of other fragments. The man is led by a beardless Anebos boy, recalls the Ephesians of 516, who should be hanged to a man Hebedon, and leave their city to the boys Aneboy. Those citizens stumbled like drunken men, and a drunken is worse than a child. So likewise the verb epaion, not perceiving where he goes, echoes by inversion the definition of temperance or sound thinking. Sophrenein in 32, to act and speak, perceiving, epaiontes, things according to their nature, as Bolak Wiseman points out. The participial constructions develop a kind of causal analysis in 3 stages. The man has lost control of his body because he has lost his perception, because the lucidity of his psyche has been weakened by fluids. So over to 108. Plutarch. As Heraclitus says, it is better to hide one's folly, amatia, but that is difficult in one's cup and at ease, end of quote. Bywater and Burnet accepted the reference to drinking as a Heraclitian. If so, 108 would be appropriate here after 106. But if, as most editors have supposed, the mention of wine is due solely to Plutarch's own adaptation of the saying, it would be difficult to give any definite point or context to 108, which then reduces to a 3-word saying of proverbial form. It is better to hide one's folly. It is true that the term for folly, amatia, echoes by negation the kind of learning from experience, mathesis, that most men lack and for which Heraclitus has a high regard. The notion of hiding also recurs in 10, where physis, or the nature of things, is said to love to hide itself. And in 536, where incredibility or incredulity, apistia, escapes being recognized. But I don't see how such verbal resonance sheds any light on 107. Well, let's linger on to 108. Porphyry. Hence Heraclitus said it was delight, not death, for souls to become moist. Porphyry is the following an allegory of Numenius, a Neo-Pythagorean philosopher of the 2nd century AD. Although this passage is often cited as a fragment of Numenius, it is in fact a paraphrase by Porphyry, which may have only the most tenuous connection with Heraclitus' own words. Hence, some commentators would disregard 108 entirely as an unreliable echo of other fragments. However, Numenius' version of 112, preserved by Porphyry in the very next sentence, does retain some of Heraclitus' original wording. So it is also possible that the old poetic word terpsis, delight, which occurs once in Herodotus, may represent Heraclitus' own description for the experience of the souls becoming moist. The fact that Numenius, this is his parenthesis, the fact that Numenius offers an allegorical exegesis of terpsis as the fall of the soul into generation suggests that the word itself is part of the text he is commenting on. This fits well with, but does not substantially add to, the idea of the soul moistening itself with drink attested in 106. So now we have the last quote. 109, also referred to D 118. A gleam of light is the dry soul, wisest and best. The transformations and deformations of 109 make one of the strangest stories in the twisted course of Heraclitean scholarship. Before discussing its meaning, we must deal with an old problem concerning the text. It is as certain as anything of this sort can be that the first three words in Heraclitus' sentence were auge, xere, psyche, gleam of light, dry soul, with the adjective dry placed ambiguously between the two nouns. That is the form in which the quotation is found in no less than 6 of our ancient authorities: Musonius, Stobaeus, Philo, Plutarch, Galen, Hermias. The accuracy of this version is confirmed by the fact that only this ambiguous position for the adjective can explain the existence of 3 ancient variants. One in which the ambiguity is avoided by placing the adjective after psyche, so that it must be construed dry soul and not dry beam of light. 2, one in which the wording is altered in the opposite sense, so that the only possible reading is dry beam of light. And finally, 3, a late and shortened version reflecting the construal in 1, but where all mention of auge, gleam, has been omitted, and we are left with the phrase dry soul as subject of the sentence. The Renaissance editor Stephanus, Henri Estienne, followed by Bywater and by many editors since, thought that the chief variance could be explained by positing the comparatively rare word aoe, psyche, dry soul, as the Heraclitean original, and then taking auge, gleam, as a corruption for this unfamiliar form. But the form aoe is simply unattested in the ancient and medieval tradition of 109, down to the 14th century, where auge is given in 11 ancient works by 9 different authors, including 3 of our best sources for Heraclitus' text, Plutarch, Clement, and Stobaeus. There is no sound paleographical basis for altering the text. An emendation would be justified only if the text as transmitted did not make good sense, but as well as we shall see, it makes excellent sense. The textual question resolved, we are faced with the syntactical ambiguity from which the variance arose, since 109 consists of 2 feminine nouns, auge and psyche, and 3 feminine adjectives, dry, wisest, and best, and the last 2 adjectives can be construed only with psyche. It is natural to try taking the first adjective with auge. This gives us the equation a dry beam of light, the wisest and the best soul. This construction is attested in two ancient sources, and it accounts for Ficino's Latin version, Luxica anima sapientissima. But the difficulty is that if a dry light might make some sense in Latin or English, a dry auge seems to make very little sense. For auge is normally used for the rays of sun, the flash of lightning, the glare of fire, the sheen of gold or brass, even for the rays or brilliance of the eyes. It is regularly a visual phenomena in which dryness and moisture seems to play no part. Hence Plutarch and Clement, the two ancient authors best acquainted with Heraclitus' riddling style, both realized that the full meaning of 109 required taking dry with soul as counterpart to moist soul in 106, and both adjusted their quotations to make this clear. It would be agreeable to my general scheme of interpretation to find some significance in this syntactical ambiguity, and to offer a reading of 109 according to both constructions. And at least one ancient author, Porphyry, thought he could make sense of the phrase dry auge. But in this case, I do not see that the ambiguity enriches our understanding of 109 enough to be worth attending to. Hence, I consider only the reading that construes xere, dry, as attributive with soul, as in the best ancient tradition, and takes auge, gleam, as the predicate. We thus have two statements with a singular subject. One, dry psyche is a beam of light. And two, dry psyche is wisest and best. This gives us a new dimension to Heraclitus' doctrine of the soul, just as moisture weakens the soul so that it may perish into water, so dryness strengthens and improves it, to make the point where it may be purified as light, not as fire. Looking back to 190, we see that the conception of the psyche in terms of light was probably anticipated in the riddle about the man who lights a lamp, Faust light, for himself in the night. But the lamp, there was a nocturnal substitute for the true life of the psyche in the light of day. And it is, of course, daylight that is suggested by the term auge in 109. Now auge can refer to any gleam or radiance, including the flare of fire or the glistening of a bright metal. But the poetic associations of the word connect it with the light of the sun as a figure for life itself, as in the Homeric phrase, to see the rays, augai, of the sun, meaning to be alive. The radiance of the sunlit sky thus stands traditionally for life. It is the innovation of Heraclitus to identify this physically with the finest state of the psyche. You see here, it is like the spiritu, the anima, is being reborn. It has been gone for millennia from the Western thinking, reduced to something of the physoi, the physis. And as a materially extended box, I would say, it has been questioned by Ludwig Wittgenstein in the private language problem. But it's still so hard to fathom. And then it was questioned by Heidegger, who saw the reduction of everything as physis, and the horrible slaughtering of language into terminology or monosemic tradition, that the words was just referring to something else, both of which completely unknown, of course. Put not knowing into the scheme, Unheimlichkeit. But here with Heraclitus, one starts to understand clearly what it is about. One sees here that it is about reviving the soul, because the soul is afflicted or related to temper, to anger, to happiness. While tempering those things, one can reach into the immortal soul, the Athanasos. Let's have a look. Heraclitus' take on the soul is that it is real, it is not an existence. That is also echoing the words of Auge Bohr. How can you ridicule quantum mechanics and reducing it to existence? Existence is not real. It is a metaphysical construct that takes as both ends, as both the wording of the term is nonsensical. Even more close. Oh. Ah. Good timing. Yeah. So oddly enough, Heraclitus came to the aid of showing us out of the bottle of nonsensical and reductionist thoughts and thinkings. And this is a rather grand thing in itself. It cannot be greater than that. Look at the majesty. Would people have built this if they believed that the soul was in existence? Do you think anyone would have spent 50 years constructing massive churches, or 200 years like the Hagia Sophia, if they thought that God was merely existing? Existence is a Platonian/Aristotelian Socratic reduction of everything. It's the killing off of reality as such. It is making both language and the physics unknown, not knowing enter the place. And this is this not knowing that makes a lot of modern people not even have entrance to their own thinking, which must be a torture beyond belief. Thank you very much for your kind patience and have a very nice afternoon. Bye bye.